May 3, 1945. 14:27 hours. Shuri Village, central Okinawa. Sachiko Miyagi clutched her 4-year-old daughter Yuki closer as the wooden beams above their heads groaned under the weight of collapsed masonry. The American artillery barrage had ended 20 minutes ago, but their house had become their tomb, trapped beneath debris that grew heavier with each passing minute. Through the gap where their kitchen window used to be, Sachiko could hear voices speaking English. American soldiers were in the village. According to everything the military police had told them, this meant rape, torture, and death for any civilians the demons discovered. She covered Yuki's mouth to prevent any sound that might reveal their location. Then she heard something that made no sense. An American voice calling out in broken Japanese, "Dereka imasuka? Tasukemasu? Is anyone there? We'll help you." When Private Danny Kowalski from Detroit crawled through the rubble and found them, Sachiko expected to die. Instead, the young soldier carefully lifted the beam that was pinning her legs, then gently carried Yuki to safety before returning for her mother. As machine gun fire cracked overhead from Japanese positions, he shielded them with his own body while guiding them toward the American aid station. For Japanese civilians who had been conditioned to expect slaughter from American demons, the most shocking revelation of defeat came not from brutality, but from witnessing enemy soldiers risk their own lives to protect the very people they were supposed to exterminate. The propaganda of fear. The systematic conditioning of Okinawan civilians to fear American capture had been comprehensive and thorough, designed to prevent surrender and ensure continued resistance even when military defeat became inevitable. Radio broadcasts, military announcements, and neighborhood meetings had spent months painting Americans as subhuman monsters who committed atrocities for pleasure. The propaganda emphasized racial hatred and portrayed Americans as mixed-race demons who possessed no honor, mercy, or human emotion. Children learned songs about brave Japanese who chose death over the dishonor of falling into enemy hands. School lessons taught that capture by Americans meant fates worse than death, torture, mutilation, and degradation that made suicide the only honorable choice. Village leaders repeated military orders that anyone showing white flags or attempting to surrender would be executed as traitors to the emperor. Families were instructed to kill themselves rather than face capture, with weapons and poison distributed specifically for mass suicide when American forces approached their communities. The psychological conditioning was so complete that many civilians genuinely believed death was preferable to contact with Americans who represented everything evil in their understanding of the world. When American forces approached Okinawan communities, families often chose suicide rather than risk capture by enemies they considered worse than demons. The reality of combat. American forces advancing through Okinawan villages encountered civilian populations that had been systematically terrorized by their own government into choosing death over surrender. The discovery of families who had killed themselves rather than accept American protection created profound psychological impacts on soldiers who had never imagined their approach could trigger such tragic responses. The urban warfare required to clear Japanese defensive positions inevitably involved civilian areas where families had been unable or unwilling to evacuate before fighting began. American forces found themselves simultaneously engaging enemy soldiers and protecting non-combatants who were caught between opposing armies with no safe escape routes. Rules of engagement emphasized civilian protection, but the realities of combat made such protection extremely difficult when Japanese forces deliberately used civilian areas for defensive positions. American soldiers faced constant dilemmas between military objectives and humanitarian obligations that required instant decisions under life-threatening conditions. Many American personnel had never encountered civilian populations during previous Pacific campaigns, which had primarily involved military garrisons on isolated islands. The presence of families, elderly people, and children in combat zones required tactical and psychological adjustments that challenged soldiers trained for conventional military operations. The first rescues. The initial encounters between American soldiers and Okinawan civilians occurred throughout April and May 1945 as combat operations moved through populated areas where families had been unable to reach designated evacuation sites. These meetings consistently followed patterns that shocked both sides and challenged preconceptions about enemy character. Corporal Bobby Martinez from San Antonio had fought through 2 years of Pacific campaigns before reaching Okinawa. His experience with Japanese military fanaticism had prepared him for continued resistance, but the discovery of terrified families hiding in destroyed buildings required responses that no military training had provided. "We found them everywhere," Martinez wrote to his wife. "Old folks, women, little kids hiding in basements and bombed-out houses. They were so scared they couldn't even cry. When they saw us coming, some of them tried to kill themselves rather than be captured. We had to move real slow and gentle to convince them we weren't going to hurt them." The civilian response to American contact ranged from terror to attempted suicide to gradual acceptance as evidence accumulated that the soldiers intended protection rather than harm. The process of establishing trust often took hours or days of patient demonstration that American intentions were humanitarian rather than hostile. The medical imperative. American medical personnel treating civilian casualties discovered conditions that exceeded anything they had encountered during previous military campaigns. Many civilians had been without adequate food, clean water, or medical care for weeks while hiding from combat operations that had destroyed infrastructure and disrupted normal community services. Army Medic Staff Sergeant James Sullivan had trained for treating combat casualties, not caring for malnourished children and elderly civilians who had been living in conditions that threatened basic survival. His medical supplies were designed for trauma treatment, not the nutritional deficiencies and diseases that he found among civilian populations. They were in terrible shape, Sullivan documented in his medical reports. Kids with infections that hadn't been treated, old people who were dehydrated and starving, women who had been taking care of their families without any resources. We gave them what we had: water, food, medicine, but it was obvious they'd been suffering for a long time. The medical treatment provided to civilian casualties became one of the most powerful demonstrations of American humanitarian intentions. Professional medical care administered without regard for nationality or military status proved that Americans valued human life even when those lives belonged to enemy populations. The language of kindness. Communication barriers between American personnel and Japanese civilians created opportunities for demonstrating good intentions through actions rather than words. Simple gestures of kindness. Offering water, sharing food, providing medical attention, communicated humanitarian concern that transcended linguistic differences. The few American personnel who spoke Japanese became crucial intermediaries who could explain American intentions and reassure civilians that protection was genuine rather than deceptive. These interpreters often found themselves serving as cultural bridges between groups that had been conditioned to expect the worst from each other. Sergeant Robert Yamamoto, a Nisei soldier from California, discovered that his ability to speak Japanese made him invaluable for civilian contact operations. His presence in American military uniform challenged civilian assumptions about American racial policies while providing credible evidence of American humanitarian values. When they found out I was Japanese American, they couldn't believe it, Yamamoto recalled. They thought all Japanese in America had been killed or enslaved. Learning that my family was safe, that I had grown up American while keeping Japanese culture, it challenged everything they thought they knew about America. The children's trust. The interactions between American soldiers and Japanese children often provided the most powerful evidence of genuine humanitarian intentions. Children's natural curiosity and resilience made them more willing to accept kindness from strangers, while their responses influenced adult attitudes toward American personnel. The distribution of candy, chewing gum, and small toys to Japanese children created visible demonstrations that Americans possessed normal human emotions and cultural values that prioritized child welfare. These interactions helped convince skeptical adults that American behavior represented policy rather than individual aberration. 8-year-old Hiroshi Nakamura had been hiding with his family in a bombed school building when American soldiers discovered their shelter. His initial terror gave way to fascination when Corporal Eddie Rodriguez offered him a piece of chocolate and tried to communicate through gestures and simple Japanese phrases learned from a phrase book. "The soldier smiled at me," Hiroshi recalled decades later. "He had kind eyes, not monster eyes like we had been told. When he gave me chocolate, I didn't know what it was. I had never seen chocolate before. But the taste was wonderful, and the man seemed happy that I liked it." The dangerous rescues. Many civilian rescue operations required American personnel to expose themselves to enemy fire while protecting non-combatants who were trapped in contested areas. These actions demonstrated commitment to civilian welfare that exceeded military necessity and revealed character traits that contradicted Japanese propaganda about American brutality. The rescue of civilians from burning buildings, collapsed structures, and areas under active fire required courage that went beyond normal combat duties. Soldiers who volunteered for such operations often did so despite tactical situations that made civilian rescue extremely dangerous for the rescuers. Private First Class Tony Rizzo from Brooklyn found himself repeatedly volunteering for rescue operations that other soldiers considered too risky. His motivation came from personal experience with urban disasters that had taught him techniques for finding and evacuating people trapped in collapsed buildings. "I grew up in tenements, where fires and building collapses happened all the time," Rizzo explained. "When I saw those civilians trapped in the rubble, I couldn't just leave them there. Yeah, it was dangerous with snipers still around, but what kind of person walks away from kids who need help?" The sniper's dilemma. American soldiers conducting civilian rescue operations often faced sniper fire from Japanese positions that were reluctant to engage, while civilians were in the line of fire. This created tactical situations where civilian protection provided some security for rescue operations, while also creating moral dilemmas for Japanese defenders. The presence of Japanese civilians in rescue situations forced Japanese soldiers to choose between engaging American targets and avoiding civilian casualties. Many Japanese positions held their fire rather than risk killing their own people, creating opportunities for rescue operations that might have been impossible under normal combat conditions. These situations revealed the complexity of warfare involving civilian populations where military objectives conflicted with humanitarian concerns for both sides. American rescue operations succeeded partly because Japanese soldiers shared concern for civilian welfare that transcended immediate tactical considerations. The moral complexity of these situations affected both American and Japanese personnel who found themselves cooperating indirectly to protect civilian lives while remaining enemies in military terms. The shared humanity revealed in these moments challenged assumptions about the absolute nature of wartime enmity. The supply sharing. American forces consistently shared their rations, medical supplies, and equipment with Japanese civilians, despite logistical constraints that made such generosity potentially costly for military operations. The systematic nature of this sharing demonstrated policy-level commitment to civilian welfare rather than individual charity. Military rations designed to sustain combat operations were distributed to civilians who had been without adequate food for weeks. K-rations containing canned meat, crackers, chocolate, and cigarettes provided better nutrition than many civilians had received during months of wartime rationing and combat disruption. The casual generosity of sharing valuable military resources with enemy civilians suggested abundance that exceeded Japanese understanding of wartime logistics. Americans could afford to give away supplies that Japanese forces would have hoarded carefully, demonstrating industrial capacity that supported humanitarian policies. Mess Sergeant Frank Kowalski supervised food distribution that often included hot meals prepared specifically for civilian recipients. His kitchen staff worked extended hours to provide culturally appropriate foods that would be acceptable to Japanese dietary preferences. We cooked extra rice, made soup with vegetables when we could get them, tried to prepare food that kids and old people could digest easily, Kowalski recalled. These people were starving, and we had more food than we needed. It wasn't heroic, it was just human decency. The cultural sensitivity. American personnel demonstrated cultural awareness and respect that contradicted propaganda about American ignorance and barbarism. Simple gestures like removing shoes before entering homes, bowing appropriately to elderly people, and respecting family relationships showed understanding of Japanese customs that impressed civilian observers. The effort to provide culturally appropriate assistance, finding Japanese-speaking interpreters, preparing familiar foods, respecting religious practices, demonstrated respect for civilian dignity that exceeded minimum humanitarian requirements. These gestures helped establish trust that enabled continued cooperation between American forces and civilian populations. Military chaplains worked with Buddhist priests and Shinto practitioners to provide spiritual comfort to civilians who had lost family members or homes during combat operations. This religious cooperation demonstrated American tolerance for different faiths that challenged propaganda about Christian persecution of other religions. The systematic attention to cultural sensitivity revealed American training and policies that emphasized civilian protection and respect for local customs. The consistency of respectful behavior across different units suggested institutional values rather than individual preferences. The medical miracles. American military medical capabilities applied to civilian casualties often produced results that seemed miraculous to populations that had been without adequate medical care for months. The availability of antibiotics, surgical capabilities, and professional medical attention saved lives that would have been lost under wartime Japanese medical limitations. The treatment of civilian children with diseases and injuries that had gone untreated during combat operations created dramatic recoveries that impressed entire communities. Parents who watched their children's health improve under American medical care became powerful advocates for American humanitarian values. Dr. Robert Sterling, an Army physician assigned to civilian medical care, found himself treating conditions that ranged from malnutrition to war wounds to diseases that had been endemic in civilian populations before American arrival. His mobile medical unit became a focal point for civilian-military cooperation. "We saw everything," Dr. Sterling documented. Kids with infected wounds, elderly people with pneumonia, families who'd been living on grass and whatever they could scavenge. The medicine we gave them, antibiotics, vitamins, basic medical care, made differences they thought were miracles. The infrastructure repair. American engineering units often prioritized restoration of civilian infrastructure alongside military construction projects. The repair of water systems, electrical generation, and transportation networks demonstrated commitment to civilian welfare that supported entire communities rather than just individual families. Combat engineers who had trained for building military facilities found themselves repairing schools, hospitals, and community centers that served civilian populations. These projects required resources and time that could have been devoted to military objectives, but were pursued because civilian welfare was considered strategically important. The systematic approach to infrastructure repair impressed Japanese civilians who observed American organizational capabilities and resource availability. The efficiency of American engineering operations revealed capabilities that exceeded anything most civilians had witnessed from their own government during peacetime. Captain William Hayes commanded an engineer battalion that rebuilt water treatment facilities, repaired electrical systems, and restored transportation networks throughout central Okinawa. His unit worked around the clock to provide services that civilian communities needed for basic survival. "We weren't just winning battles," Hayes explained to his superiors. "We were proving to these people that Americans could build as well as destroy, that we cared about their communities and their futures, not just defeating their military." Was the educational outreach. American personnel established temporary schools and educational programs for civilian children whose education had been disrupted by combat operations and evacuation from their communities. These programs provided psychological stability alongside academic instruction during periods of extreme uncertainty. Military personnel with teaching backgrounds volunteered to work with Japanese educators who had survived the fighting to create educational environments that combined American resources with Japanese cultural content. The collaborative approach demonstrated respect for Japanese intellectual traditions while providing materials and facilities that had been destroyed during combat. The availability of books, paper, pencils, and other school supplies impressed civilian communities that had been without such resources for months. The investment in enemy children's education suggested American confidence in peaceful futures that transcended immediate military objectives. Teachers who worked with these programs often found the experience personally rewarding despite the challenges of cross-cultural education during military occupation. The enthusiasm of Japanese children for learning created positive interactions that influenced American attitudes toward civilian populations. The psychological transformation. The cumulative impact of American humanitarian actions created psychological transformation among Japanese civilians who gradually abandoned propaganda-induced fears and developed trust in their former enemies. This transformation often occurred slowly as evidence accumulated that American intentions were genuinely protective. Individual civilians who benefited from American assistance became advocates within their communities for cooperation with occupation forces. Their personal testimonies provided credible evidence that contradicted propaganda narratives about American character and intentions. The transformation wasn't immediate or universal. Some civilians remained suspicious of American motives for months after initial contact, while others adapted quickly to evidence that contradicted their previous beliefs about enemy character and behavior. Children often adapted most readily to American presence, forming friendships with soldiers who provided candy and attention while demonstrating that foreigners could be kind and trustworthy. These relationships helped convince skeptical adults that American intentions were genuine. The strategic impact. The humanitarian treatment of Japanese civilians achieved strategic objectives that military force alone couldn't accomplish. The demonstration of American values created positive relationships that supported occupation policies and contributed to successful reconstruction efforts. Civilian cooperation with American forces provided intelligence about remaining military resistance, facilitated administration of occupied territories, and supported economic recovery that benefited both Japanese communities and American strategic objectives. The investment in civilian welfare generated returns that exceeded the costs of humanitarian assistance. International observers who learned about American treatment of Japanese civilians gained evidence of democratic values that supported diplomatic efforts to build post-war alliances. The demonstration of mercy toward enemy populations provided moral authority that enhanced American leadership during Reconstruction. The psychological impact on remaining Japanese military personnel was significant, as word spread about American treatment of civilians who had cooperated with occupation forces. This information undermined propaganda about American brutality and encouraged surrender rather than continued resistance. The individual stories, personal accounts from both American soldiers and Japanese civilians provided human context for humanitarian operations that transcended abstract policy discussions. These stories revealed the emotional complexity of showing kindness to former enemies while processing the trauma of combat operations. Many American soldiers struggled with the psychological challenge of protecting people whose government had been trying to kill them just days or weeks earlier. The transition from combat operations to humanitarian assistance required emotional adjustments that some found difficult to manage. Japanese civilians who received American assistance often experienced guilt about accepting help from enemies, while their own military had failed to provide protection. The complex emotions of survival, gratitude, and loyalty created psychological conflicts that required time to resolve. The personal relationships that developed between individual Americans and Japanese families created bonds that lasted long beyond immediate humanitarian crises. These connections provided emotional foundations for broader political reconciliation between former enemies. The ultimate paradox. The ultimate paradox of American humanitarian conduct on Okinawa lay in the fact that the same forces capable of massive destruction also demonstrated extraordinary compassion toward the very people they had been fighting. This contradiction challenged simple narratives about warfare and revealed the complexity of human behavior under extreme conditions. For Japanese civilians who experienced American rescue operations, the contradiction between expected brutality and actual kindness created cognitive dissonance that forced fundamental re-evaluation of their understanding of enemies, allies, and human nature itself. The experience proved that people could transcend national boundaries and ideological differences to recognize common humanity. American soldiers who participated in rescue operations discovered that their enemies possessed the same basic human needs and emotions that motivated their own behavior. The recognition of shared humanity created empathy that transcended military objectives and political differences. The enduring memory. In the end, the most shocking aspect of American conduct for Japanese civilians wasn't the military power that defeated Japanese forces, but the human compassion that protected Japanese lives at risk to American personnel. This memory became more powerful than propaganda about enemy brutality because it was based on direct personal experience rather than abstract ideological conditioning. The civilians who couldn't believe American troops risked their lives to save them carried that disbelief throughout their lives, not because the events seemed untrue, but because they seemed too good to be true. In a world where enemies were expected to show only hatred, the discovery of compassion from former foes represented hope that human nature could transcend the worst impulses of warfare. For the American soldiers who chose humanity over hatred, mercy over vengeance, and protection over destruction, their actions proved that democratic values could survive the most extreme tests of warfare. They demonstrated that strength could be measured not just by the ability to destroy enemies, but by the courage to save them when they needed help. The memory of these rescue operations became testament to the possibility that former enemies could become friends, that warfare could include mercy alongside violence, and that individual acts of compassion could plant seeds of peace that would bloom into decades of friendship between nations that had fought with deadly determination just months before the hands of American soldiers reached out to pull Japanese civilians from the rubble of war toward the safety of a shared future built on the foundation of recognized humanity.